Hi everyone, welcome back to SoCal Socialite. I am Emily and I'm here today to talk to you about the Agnes knit top pattern from Tilly and the Buttons. So this video is not just a pattern review, but it is also a sew along. I'm really excited about this make. I have probably for the past several weeks have kind of lost my sojo because the last couple of things that I have made haven't fit very well despite my pattern tweaking, and I'm so excited because this one fits incredibly well, like pretty much straight out of the package. Like I just made some very minor tweaks, like took 1/8 of an inch off of each side seam for a total of a 1/2 inch all around. And even if I didn't do that, this would have fit perfectly. So I'm just super excited. So this, let me just turn around. The Agnes pattern from Tilly and the Buttons is, it's a top, okay? So I've made it into a dress. So the top, it comes in 3/4 sleeves. You can either have a plain sleeve or a ruched sleeve like I have here, okay? This is done with elastic, and then you can have a plain neckline or you can have it ruched and it comes into a sweetheart neckline, and this is also done with elastic. And what I have done is, instead of having the full 3/4 sleeve, I shortened it a bit, which I really like the look of that. In fact, I could probably even go a little bit shorter if I wanted. And to make a dress, all you need to do is chop the bodice at the waistline and then draft yourself 2 rectangles to accommodate your length and then as much as you want for gathers, and then you just sew on the skirt. It's so simple. And if you haven't sewn a Tilly and the Buttons pattern, I suggest that you do, because her instructions are so clear and they come with colored pictures for every step. I mean, that's one reason I really love the indie patterns, is because they, the instructions are just so good. And at first I was like, who wants like print all these sheets of paper and tape them and cut them? But I'm finding that that's actually a very soothing kind of process for me. I'll just, in the evening, I'll just get my sheets of paper that I printed. Now I glue them with my glue stick. I find that easier. And then I just cut them and I have a TV show on. It's actually very relaxing. And so I'm enjoying it. It's just storing them isn't very, it's harder than the pattern of me. So I have my notes on the floor and I'm making sure that I have everything I want to tell you, because I realize sometimes I forget. So, oh yes, the fabric. So let's take a look at the fabric. It is really pretty. It is blue and black with these little like peach kind of abstract dots. And this is a double knit. It's a brush double knit, 85% polyester, 15% spandex. I got it at Joann, and it is so soft and so buttery, and it's kind of like more like a medium weight. So it is, like today in San Diego it was pretty hot, so it kind of got a little bit hot in it, but I like it because it'll still be great for like fall and cooler temperatures. So I can just put some tights on and little boots or something and still wear this dress. Just gonna show you. So here I thought that my neckband was a little bit loose, and it could probably actually, because neckbands, you have to cut them to be smaller than the neckline so that way they lay flat. Otherwise, if you cut them the same, they're just gonna like wobble and stand up. So Tilly's pattern has you cut it 10% less than the measurement of the neckline. I'm used to cutting it at about 20%. So when I make this pattern again, I'll cut it maybe 15%, because I still think this is fine. But I think when I do certain movements, it kind of pops up That's the only complaint I have, and it's like barely even a complaint because when I'm just standing, it's perfect. So, and now to get to the sew-along, which is going to happen right after I stop rambling. This is my very first sew-along, and sew-alongs are difficult because you have, well, it is for me because I sew, or I film every little bit that I sew, and I don't always know, like, is it too much? Is it boring for you? So the way that this video ended up being, it's like you were in the room sewing with me, hence sew-along. So, I don't know, give me your feedback on what you like in terms of a sew-along because it's hard to gauge. I will put timestamps in the description box below for certain techniques like inserting the elastic for the ruching or for when I put the neckband on. So if you're looking for a certain step in pattern making or a certain technique, you can just jump there. You don't have to watch the whole thing. But yeah, your feedback is appreciated, and I'm just like incredibly happy. I think if I just sew a bunch of these, then that's it. And I want to like just, all I want to buy now is this brushed double knit poly spandex. Like, I wasn't a knit person, I preferred wovens, but after sewing with this, which is an absolute dream to sew with, that's all I want to sew. But anyway, I'm going to stop rambling and we're going to start the sew along. And thank you so much for watching my videos. I am inching towards 600 subscribers, so that's really exciting for me. I'm a little channel, but it means a lot that people actually like to watch me, which is kind of strange. But thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Hi everyone. To get started, let's talk about the sewing supplies that we will need. Of course, you're going to need your fabric, and I am using a fabric I got at Joann. It is 85% polyester and 15% spandex. It's got some good stretch to it. Now remember, you need fabric that stretches at least 25% on the cross grain there. This fabric, if you have a chance to go to Joann, they have this collection of these really stretchy knits, printed knits, and they are just so buttery and soft, and they just feel so good, and they're like kind of a medium weight, I guess, medium to sort of lightweight, and they just feel so good. And I had been looking at this one in particular, and finally I decided to just buy it and make this Tilly and the buttons Agnes top dress. So we have our instructions, right? We have our fabric. We're going to need thread. I'm using just basic black from Gutermann. That's my choice typically for threads. Then you'll need your basic supplies like pins. If you're going to be pinning your pattern pieces, you'll need cutting utensils, like here's cut your pattern out. You want to cut your fabric, rotary cut if you want to cut your fabric with rotary, which I prefer these days. And then aside from that, you're going to need some clear elastic, and that is to put that in the shoulder seam to stabilize it. Some other elastic you will need are some braided elastic, and you can either use an 1/8 or 1/4 inch, which Tilly says in her pattern. This is to provide the ruching in the sleeves, and I'm going to be ruching the neckline to give it a sweetheart neckline, so I'll be using it in both places, and I might use both sizes. I'm not sure what sizes I'm going to use yet, but I will determine that later. And you'll need something to mark your elastic lines. There's not a whole lot of marking in this pattern, which is really great. But I will probably use this friction pen. You can use chalk, you can use tailor's carbon, whatever works for you, but you will need to mark. And it is recommended that you use either ballpoint or stretch needles. I have here a stretch needle in 75/11 size. I also have 90/14, so I'm going to check and see what works best with my fabric. but I'll be sewing this on my regular sewing machine using a zigzag stitch, and then I'll finish off the seams with my serger. But you sew either with your serger or with just your regular machine, however you prefer. And I think that is all that we need. And let's go ahead and take a look at our pattern pieces. So we've got our neckband, and then we have got our bodice right here. So I have, don't mind my markings, and I have altered this to the way I want it to fit and so forth. And I also, when you're using the Agnes bodice or shirt pattern to make the dress, you need to shorten it wherever you want at your waistline so that you can add a skirt to it. And I'll put a link below that shows you on Tilly and the Buttons website. It explains how to do it. So you've got your bodice front and bodice back pieces both cut on the fold. You've got your sleeve, and I have shortened this sleeve. I wanted it to be short and not 3/4, so I've altered that as well. And then you're going to need to draft a basic rectangle. Here's mine, based on your measurements and how full you want your skirt and how long you want your skirt. And again, there'll be a link below on Tilly's website that shows you how to do that. So let's go ahead, get started, and cut out our fabric. The first thing we're going to cut out are the bodices. So what the instructions tell you to do, and what is a common thing to do to save fabric, is to go ahead and fold your fabric so that the selvages will meet in the middle. So you can see that I have my fabric folded on either side so that the selvages are in the middle. And I folded this one just enough so that I could get this bodice on, and you can see my lovely pattern weights, one of my little crystals, and then it's the paperweight. And one thing I like to do is to leave, I don't cut on the center front line, I just kind of leave some paper there. That way it's just easier for me to match up the line, I find, and it's just, I feel a little bit more accurate because my cutting can get wonky on a straight line. So this is what you're going to do. So go ahead and cut out your your bodice patterns, and then we'll move on to the sleeve and the neckband. I do want to point out real quickly that I like to now use a rotary cutter when cutting because I find it more accurate, and this one I got from Kai, and it's really great because depending on the pressure you can set the amount of pressure you want to use. So focus. So if it's soft, that means I don't have to put a lot of pressure on it on the wheel when I cut, or hard means I have to put a lot of pressure when I cut. So it's kind of a cool feature. So this is what I've been using, and I really like this rotary cutter. And I also have some blades that I got, inexpensive blades I got on Amazon, which I've been working out really well, and I'll link them below in case you're interested. Next, I'm cutting out the sleeve, and as you can see, my fabric is folded and I have barely enough room to accomplish this, and I'm using my clear ruler to help me get the grain line correct. I am supposed to cut this lovely little neckband out on the fold here, but as you can see, I don't have quite enough fabric. So what I'm going to do is, when I'm done cutting this out, is I'm going to just fold it the other direction, which is okay in this case because my fabric has enough stretch to accommodate this. But you know, just make sure that if you have to do something like this, that your fabric has that 25% stretch in it, and you should be okay. So hey, you just got to make it work, right? So now we want to make sure that our pattern pieces are prepared with the notches and markings before we start sewing. So here I have made sure that my front bodice has all of its notches. Next, we are going to go ahead and mark the, make the elastic stitching line. So I've lined up my bodice piece So right here is the center front, and you're going to start the marking here. So I'm just going to kind of poke a hole. Sometimes it doesn't, my marking pin doesn't like to mark, you know what I mean. So that's where that one is, and then it ends right here, it looks like. So I'm just making a hole in the paper, and then this is basically so I know where this line's going to end. My clear ruler here, and I've notched center front. It just makes life easier to know where things are. So I've got this dot and I've got this dot, and I just want to draw a line between the two. If my pen will cooperate. Sometimes they don't want to. I don't know why. But we're gonna make it work, because that's what this is all about. So hopefully you can see my line. Not really on camera, but let me show you. Here I have my line. Now we need to mark the shoulder, or I'm sorry, the sleeves, and we'll do it in the same way that we marked the bodice. So I've switched to this washable marking pen. The nice thing about this is, since this is like lighter on the back, it'll show up on the back, but it won't show up on the front, and it's washable. So these Crayola markers are good for certain fabrics, and plus you can see it now on camera. So I've basically done the same thing. I've just poked holes, made my markings, drew the line in, and I made sure that I have my notches. I'm going to go ahead and do it to the other sleeve, and then we'll be ready to actually start sewing. So the first step is to attach some clear elastic to the back bodice shoulder seam. The reason we need to do this is to stabilize the shoulder, because knit fabrics have a tendency to stretch out and you don't want to distort your shoulder seam. So I've gone ahead and marked off my seam allowance here in the blue pen so you can see it, and I have some clear elastic here, and it's 3/8 of an inch wide. I think anything will do, and if you don't have a clear elastic, you can use a ribbon, and you can use stay tape. I think you can even stick some interfacing if you have nothing else, just to put something in there to stabilize that shoulder. So you're going to want to cut pieces that are slightly longer than the shoulder seams. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to cut myself 2. And there's the second one. And when you stitch it in, you're going to stitch it just inside the 5/8, and you're going to use a zigzag seam. So I'm going to go ahead and take this over to the machine so you can see how that is, and I'll explain what like stitch and zigzag and all that jazz that I'm using. Okay, we're here at the sewing machine, and there's a couple of things I wanted to point out before we start. And that is to first make sure that you are using the appropriate needle. I'm using a stretch needle by Schmetz. And when attaching your stabilizer, or you're going to want to set your stitch width. She recommends, Tilly recommends that is, either 2 or 2.5 millimeter width, and then also in length 2 or 2.5 millimeter. And I've set mine to 2 and 2, and you are on a zigzag stitch, with on my machine is also 2. So I just wanted to point that out to make sure that you've got the proper settings, and it is imperative that you use either a stretch or ballpoint needle, otherwise it's not going to work so well, because you've got stretchy fabrics and you want to make sure that instead of piercing with like a universal or a sharp needle, that you're using a ballpoint or a rounded needle to just kind of push through the loops as opposed to piercing them, because you'll just get better results. So here, let's try to move this closer. I'm just laying the elastic, you can see it here, kind of just to the right of my seam line that I have drawn, and I'm going to just use the foot to hold it down, and I'm going to start by stitching a couple, and then I'm going to back tack, and I'm going to go forward, and I'm just going to hold that elastic in place. I'm not pulling it, I'm not pulling anything, I'm holding it in place, and I'm just going to stitch over that elastic so that my presser foot is in the middle of that elastic. Let me just do that all the way through. Making sure that that elastic is parallel to my seam line on the right side. And you get to the end, and I'm going to back tack. Voila. And that's what that looks like, okay? I'm going to trim. I'll trim it even closer later, but you can go ahead and trim it off. And I do want to show you something. So my stretch needle that I'm using is a 75/11 size, and I first did my the other shoulder, but I used a 90, I think it's 90/14 size needle, and look, you can see that I have skipped, the stitching is a little wonky. So before you dive into stitching your fabric, double check that you've got the right needle size, all that good stuff, because otherwise this is what happens. But that's okay, I'm gonna leave it, no big deal, it's been there. But I wanted to point that out because that's just how it is with sewing, right? So let's move on to the next step. The next step requires us to attach the front and back bodices together at the shoulder seam. So I have pinned one side, but you can see you're putting the bodices together, right sides together. And what you're going to do is match up the notches here. Let's get in there so I can show you the notches. See there? The notches are matched up, and you just go ahead and pin. I happen to have the seam line drawn in, so I've pinned along the seam line, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew both of these together. So let me finish pinning this one, and then we'll go ahead to the machine and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so what we have here is the bodice. It's in the machine, it's against the 5/8 stitch line, it's ready to go. It's on a zigzag stitch, which is number 2 on my machine, but there's a slight difference. When you're sewing pieces together, Tilly does recommend that we use a 1 to 1.5 millimeter wide zigzag. So we've got to reduce this because we just use this to attach the stabilizer. So I'm going to go ahead to 1.5 is fine for me. And then lengthwise, she says 2 to 2.5. I'm thinking I'm going to go down to 2. I like the look of 2. Actually, I think it is on 2. So that's fine. So that's what I'm going to use to stitch this. So let's see here if you can zoom in to the wonderful world of sewing. I'm gonna start back tack a bit, pull out my pin. Now again, you are not pulling. You're just keeping your fingers on it to stabilize and make sure everything is smooth. If you pull, you're going to end up with some gathering that or bunching that you just don't want. It's not going to look good. you zigzag. The stitching is a little bit slower. It's the only thing I don't like. Back, tack there, and there you have it. Though it's a little bit, my line was a little bit different, but that's okay. We've got our clear elastic is still on the other side, which is perfect. And this is what it looks like here. Voila. So I have a serger, and I'm probably going to go ahead and serge these edges. You don't need to with this jersey fabric because these don't fray, but I like to sew and then finish. I don't just sew everything on a serger. I'm not quite comfortable yet. So I'm going to go ahead, sew up the other shoulder seam, and then I'll go to my serger and finish these edges. Okay, now I've got you over here at my Baby Lock Imagine, which is my serger, and we're going to go ahead and just finish off the shoulder seams. I have my machine set at the length as, the length as 2, and then the width is medium. Here it's 6. See that? And then I have no differential feed, it's on neutral, and the setting is A. I have 4 threads, you can see that. And what I'm going to do, let's get you in there. So I don't cut off much of my fabric, and I don't want to cut off that elastic, that clear elastic that I've got in there, because that would defeat the purpose of putting it in. So let's go ahead and, my presser foot is down, by the way. If you try to sew with it up, it is not very pretty. I'm just going to line up my fabric against this plate here, the edge of the plate, and then that way it won't cut much off. If I wanted to cut nothing off, you see this right here, it's hard to tell. You get in there, right there, you're not going to cut anything off because you're missing the blade. But how I'm going to do it is I am going to cut off like 1/8 of an inch by placing it on this outer edge, and I'll show you here. Again, don't pull. I didn't want all the wobbling on camera, but that cannot be helped. So you see there, that's what that looks like. And I mean, you could have wider stitches if you wanted. That's just my preference. I do that because if I have wider stitches, I find that if I get them caught on something, they tend to unravel or they pull the fabric, which I don't like. So you can see here, this is what was cut off, like 1/8. So not much. Before we move to the next step, we do need to press our shoulder seams, and we're going to press the seam towards the back. So you can tell this is the back of my bodice. I have the seam going this way. I have my ham for easier pressing, and I have my lovely iron. Make sure it's not set too hot or it's set appropriately for your fabric, and just go ahead and give it a nice little press there. And you can see that you get a nice seam, and it's important to press as you go. It just gives you better results. I'm a firm believer in pressing. In fact, take a look. I made this little picture. It says, "The importance of good pressing cannot be overemphasized." And I got this out of a Merchant and Mills sewing book. So please press. For the next step, we're going to go ahead and take our neckband, we're going to fold it in half like so. We're going to stitch it closed here at the end, 5/8 of an inch. And just use the same method I showed you when attaching the shoulder seams. You've got your zigzag stitch, 1 to 1.5 width, and then 2 to 2.5 lengthwise. Just stitch that together, and then we can trim the seam allowance once we're done. So let me go ahead and stitch it up, and then I'll show you what we'll do next. Okay, dropped scissors and practically stabbed myself. So I have sewn it. Here's my 5/8 seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and just trim it a little bit. Whoops, make sure I get both sides in there. Then I'll press it open with the iron. Let that cool down and set. Then we're going to go ahead and fold the band lengthwise in half. But the wrong sides are going to be together. I know we're used to right sides together, but this one we are going to be doing wrong sides together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fold it and press it all the way around. And then what we can do is we're going to pin it to the neckband once we're done. The next thing that we are going to do is pin this neckband to the bodice neckline. So the easiest way to do this to ensure that you have an even amount of stretch is to break this or fold this into quarters. So use the seam line as one of the quarters. Keeps like wanting to come unfolded, so just bear that in mind. So we have one side. You can pin it just to let yourself know. And then we want to make sure that we have I'm doing this to make sure that I get it even. One side, and then there. Get it nice and even here. Sorry about this. Ugh. Okay. So, where was that little guy? Where were you? Okay. Is pin there. All right. Now that we have these marked, pins jabbing out at me, what you want to do is you want to pin it to your bodice, and one thing to make it easier with that is to mark your center back and your center front, because then you're going to match up, you know, your quarters. So, but the one thing you want to do first is to take the seam. So here we have that seam where we attached it, and you're going to want to match it up to one of the shoulder seams. And you're going to do it right sides together. So let's take this guy here and match him up, put seam to seam. Get some pens here. You can do pens or you can do clips, up to you. But let's make sure we've got our little seams matching, because that is more professional looking, right? So that's how I'm doing it. Well, Tilly did it. Tilly's got her pens going the other way. Let's be like Tilly, okay? Tilly and the buttons. Probably better anyway. Let's do it that way. I just kind of do things my own way, and it's not necessarily the most, like, I don't know, sewing etiquette, I don't know. So what we're going to want to do now is, so you've got this one is marking this quarter, and that's going to want to match up to this marking here, which is, looks like this is the center back. Yep. So we'll take that and make sure all of your edges are nicely matched up. There we go. Right now I'm just trying to get it in place, you know, just see where everybody needs to be in alignment. It gets a little tricky. We'll worry about that. This guy here, this pin, should be at this side seam. Or not side seam, the shoulder seam. So this guy should be here. And then this pen here should be at the center front marking. So I have a center front marking there. And I actually have it notched from earlier. Okay. Then what you're gonna want to do is just go around and keep pinning. And then that way, so now that you have your quarters marked, it's going to be evenly distributed. Because if you had all your stretch in one area, well, your garment would be really kind of just distorted. So let's go ahead and just keep working and pinning the edges together and making sure to keep that stretch distributed. Now remember, that pin's not working. Now remember that your neckband is smaller than the actual hole of your neckline, and that is because you need your neckband to be smaller to stretch it out. That helps your neckline lay flat. If it were the same size and there was no stretch, well, you'd probably have some gaps or wrinkling and it wouldn't be very pretty. It looks like she has her pattern set so that the neckline or the neckband is only 10% smaller. When I've made knits in the past, I have always used a 20% smaller rule. So we'll see how this goes. You know, I'm trusting the pattern. I'm trusting Tilly. If you don't know, Tilly and the Buttons was on the Great British Sewing Bee, one of the earlier seasons, if not the first, I can't recall. But she was really cute and fun to watch. So if you haven't watched the Great British Sewing Bee, then I suggest that you do. Now that we have the neckband pinned into the neckline, we need to go ahead and take it to the sewing machine and stitch it into place. So for this part, I can remove my table so I can use the free arm here. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to baste this in first to make sure that we like the way that the band lays, and if not, it gives us the opportunity to cut another one either longer or probably smaller, most likely, since this is only, the band is only 10% smaller, and usually the rule of thumb tends to be like 20, I think. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm using a straight stitch now because I'm basting, and that's what the instruction said, and I have my pins in. So in this case, I am going to have to stretch the fabric a little bit as I go, and that is because we have to make these things fit, right? So, and we're basting at 3/8 of an inch. We are not doing 5/8, though the final seam on this is 5/8. So you see here, I'm kind of pulling it to make sure that it's straight and lined up. So in that case, you will want to pull a little bit. Uh-oh, I hate it when that happens. Okay, so we just keep doing that. What happened here? All the way around, obviously. Making sure none of that fabric gets caught up in. Sometimes I've got, you know, the actual bodice gets stuck in there if you're not careful. As I was examining my work, I noticed that there is a little bit of a tuck. Well, focus. So as you can see here, there's a tuck right there. I'm going to unpick that and finish it, but it's really good just to go through and make sure that you don't have any of those. Otherwise, I feel like my band looks pretty good, and I'll show you at the table once I unpick and finish this. I've put the bodice on one of my dress forms. I thought it'd be easier to look at instead of laying it on the table. So as you can see here, don't mind her little stain marks. Don't know what happened to her. This to me looks good. This is kind of standing up. Now I think it's just, I feel like it's because, I'm not quite sure. It's probably because it's not pressed right. And the way this dress form is, that's a dress form, but it's just like, I don't have these side seams sewn, so it's kind of like the tension there. There isn't tension to pull it down, and when you pull it down and you know it fits more snugly, this goes down. Hopefully that is the case, and this doesn't stand up. But if I do see, if you were to have, if this band were less, then it doesn't stand up, you see? So I'm not sure in the finished garment if it's going to do that or if it will go down once we've got the side seam sewn in. I guess we will just find out. Because I decided that I think that the band is actually going to be okay after everything's said and done, I'm going to take it back to the machine. And we're going to stitch all the way around again, but this time we're going to go back to our zigzag stitch and we're going to put the length at 2. And I'm going to do the width at 1.5. And we're going to do 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around, not 3/8, because this time we are actually stitching it in. And I am terrible at cutting my threads. I just don't do it. And I should. So I'm gonna go ahead and start stitching this guy. Now that my neckband is nicely sewn on and I'm happy with it, I'm just going to go over here, come to my serger, and finish off the raw edges of that neckline. And I'm going to do what I did with this seam and just line it up here to the edge so that only a little bit is taken off. So we're back over here, the ironing board with our ham, and we've got the neckband right here. I'm going to use a little bit of best press. I think it helps tame everything, get it into place. So I'm just pressing, essentially, you know, training that neckband to stay down, stay in, basically be a team player, because it needs to look nice and neat and everybody needs to cooperate for this to work. So I'm going to go ahead and just continue pressing using my best press and getting this into shape, and then when I'm done we can move on. I've put the bodice back on the mannequin just to show you, and it's looking better in the back, especially after we stitched in at 5/8 and used best press and iron. It looks pretty good, and it'll look even better once we get our side seams sewn and we have our nice finished edge in there. So far so good. So let's see what's in store for us next. So she asks to trim the seam allowances, which I don't need to do. I just used my serger on them. I mean, I could go back over it and trim off more, but she says to press the seam allowances to the inside of the bodice and then press the neckband away, which we have done. And then to top stitch with a zigzag or a twin needle the seam allowances to the bodice to keep close to the seam line. So we could kind of do like a stitch in the ditch, if you know what that means. You just kind of stitch over that seam line, and that's going to help keep those seam allowances from trying to pop into or outside of the neckline. So we can go do that, and then next we're going to do that little ruching on the center front. So let's go ahead and get those seam allowances stitched down so they won't be an annoying nuisance. Okay. For this part, we can keep the free arm. It'll be easier. And what we're going to want to do is basically, you see that? There's the seam line. If we try to keep that, see that little line there? On the seam line and just zigzag over, it's going to sew into that seam allowance and help keep it down. So I'm going to do it all the way around. I'm going to use my zigzag stitch on 2, a length of 2, and then my width is only 1.5. Keeping right on that seam line as best I can. And actually, I have to say, something that would have been easier, and I just didn't think about it, is using an edge foot, because you can just keep that right gliding on the seam, and then your needle will go exactly where you need it to. But this works fine, and this is great. You know, this is the method you'll use if you don't have one of those. So either way, whatever works best for you. As a reminder, as you're stitching, you're wanting to make sure that you're sewing through this seam allowance, so make sure it is facing that way. Otherwise, it's not going to do what it needs to do, which is stay down. You don't want it going up, you want it to stay down. Next, we're going to go ahead and do our ruched neckline. And for this, we're going to cut a 3-inch strip of elastic. I am using a 1/4 inch braided elastic. You could use an 1/8, and I was going to, but I decided I'd rather use a 1/4 inch. And then you're going to mark in 2 inches. The top of the elastic, which is this piece, that end, will be pinned to the top of your stitching line on your front bodice. The elastic after this marking is really just for you to hold and pull while you're sewing, because it's this mark that needs to match up to the bottom of your stitching line. So if we get our bodice here, sorry, one-handed here, folks, one-handed. You have your stitching line here, so can you remember? Okay, that's the back. So we have our stitching line here. You can faintly see it. I'll just go over it with my pen so you can see it on camera better when I'm stitching. And you're going to do at the top of this stitching line, top of the elastic, you're going to stretch that elastic down so this mark right here goes down to the end. Let's take it over to the sewing machine so you can see what I'm talking about. For this part, I've put my table back. Tilly suggests that we do a stitch length of 2 and the width of 2, and we're still, of course, using zigzag. So I have the center front. I have gone over my marking so you could see it. Don't sew into your stitch line there, or your, I'm sorry, your neckband. You're going to take your elastic so that this top is on top of that blue line. Let's see here. It's on top of that blue line. It's kind of funny, this line is center front, and it reminds me of a open heart surgery scar. I have one of those. So that's all I can think of when I see this. It's funny. Yeah, I've had open heart surgery when I was, the day I was born, a year later, and then at 31. So I'm familiar with this line. Okay, anyway, we're going to go ahead and start to stitch it down a little bit before we pull, okay? Let's just go forward and back. And now we can start pulling. And you're going to pull, see how I'm pulling to the ends of that line we've drawn? Let me make sure I don't have anything. I feel something under there. Okay. Somebody's always trying to get involved, and they're not supposed to be. Some other piece of the garment. Okay. So this might be a little tricky. We got to keep everything in alignment and pull at the same time. Keep your finger on it like this, and just let your machine. Okay, it's just not pulling the fabric. Come on. You might have to give it a tug in the back. It's having a little trouble going. Okay. Come on, you can do it. Come on, machine. It's going. Kind of have to give it a little pull at the back there. Oh boy. Is my elastic down where it needs to be? Almost. And then once you get to that blue mark on your elastic, back tack. I'm gonna give it a good back tack. And you lift up from the machine. Okay, so let's see what happens. This is what the result is. So, oh, there's a little bit of ruching there. Let's put it on the dress form so we could get a better look. So it's probably hard to see on camera, but the amount of ruching is not what I thought it would be, and it starts a little bit lower than I thought. So what I'm going to do is unpick it, and I'm actually going to shorten, like instead of doing 2 inches, I might do 1.5 inches in length, and then I'm going to bring up the starting position of the elastics. I want it to go a little bit higher, and so I'm gonna just unpick this and we will try again. Okay, so I've raised the starting position, so it's just gonna be just underneath that seam. And unfortunately, a little hole was made from the zigzag on my fabric, and I'm really upset, but I put fray check in there. Annoyed. So I cut this elastic, again 3 inches, but I marked it off like 1.75 inches instead of 2, and I'm raising this up. So let's see if that's going to help the situation, and I'm hoping that with the ruching that little hole is not noticeable or isn't going to give me more problems than I want. That's what happens when you sew. These things happen. Alright. I'm pulling him really not quite on the line there. Stop doing that. That's what got me in trouble in the first place. Okay. Hoping this a little tricky. Oh gosh. Things are not going well this time. Things are not going well. And I'm not quite on my blue line. I'm a little bit over, but oh well. I don't need another hole in my fabric. Alright, I'm hoping that that gives me more. Look at that. Look at all that craziness right there. Hopefully this gives us more of the effect that we're going for, and it looks like it does. So there we go. That's more what I like it. So I'm going to put this on the dress form and we will examine. Okay, so this is definitely more in line with what it looked like in the picture and what I imagined. Perhaps I did it wrong the first time. Whatever, we got what we wanted, and my whole, I don't know where it is, but let's pretend it doesn't exist. But yeah, this is more of a sweetheart neckline. It has more of the ruching there, which is super cute. And we're getting there. We are slowly but surely getting there. And let's take a look at the next piece. It looks like we're gonna go to the sleeves next. And oh boy. We're gonna do the ruching on the sleeves the same way that we did it on the front bodice. So let me just look at these instructions and I will be back. To prepare this sleeve elastic, you need to cut 2 pieces that are 6 inches in length, And then the directions say to mark up 1 inch. So you have that tail to hold on to, meaning you're going to zigzag down to this mark. But what I did is I went ahead and I shortened that. I marked up 2 inches because, so now instead of zigzagging down 5 inches, I'm only zigzagging down 4. Because I discovered, as you saw in the front bodice, that it wasn't enough ruching, and you know, not all elastics tend to stretch the same. So I have a feeling I wouldn't be happy with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and force myself to stretch more, which will give you more ruching. So in the same way that we did, whoops, the front bodice, we're going to take, because we've got these marks that we already drew on the sleeves, we're going to take the top of that elastic, start stitching, stretch this mark so it goes all the way down here, and we're going to zigzag it down. I'm going to do this to both sleeves, and yeah. Okay. So you're marking the bottom. Start here with your tape, your elastic centered over that blue line or whatever line you've drawn. There's my foot pedal. My foot pedal always ends up like 1,000 feet away from me. I don't know how. So again, give yourself a little start before you start pulling. This is going to be really interesting. That's a lot of ruching. Just like the last one, it wants to just scooch. Getting there. Yeah, like that, like maximize it. I don't think I could pull anymore. It just barely gets there. So that's good for me because I want ruching. More ruching the better. Okay, check this out. Yes, that's what we want. I can tell you I would not have been happy if I hadn't shortened that ruching area. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other sleeve and then we will move on. Don't forget on your sleeves, and go back to your bodice, you got to cut your elastic. So just give you just a little bit after the stitching. There you have it. So nicely ruched. Love it. So for the sleeve, the first thing that we need to do is put in the gathering stitches. And what I have done is I started 1/2 inch away from the raw edge. And then I went ahead and stitched again 1/4 of the way from the raw edge, and then I just went in and stitched another line in the middle to give me my 3 rows of stitching. And that's a straight stitch on your basting, which is a 4 or a 5. So now that we have our gathers in, oh, and let me just point out, the gathering, it's from your notches, so this is the double notch all the way around to the other notch. So you have a single notch and a double notch, so you have to have stitches all the way around over the top of the sleeve cap. The next thing we need to do is to pin this to the bodice. So I have actually already done one complete sleeve, just to make sure that I got the process down before showing you. So what we have to do is take your bodice, open it up. So here's your neckline, here's your shoulder seam, and then you've got your armhole notches, right? We're going to take the sleeve and its right sides together, and we're going to match up those notches and pin from the notches down. Just get some pins here. So here is the front, because it has the single notch. Pins here. Match your raw edges together. So there is this notch here on the sleeve, and this is the top of the sleeve cap. That needs to match up with this shoulder seam. Okay, so lay it right there on top of that shoulder seam. And then you're going to pin your double notches over there. Line that up. Okay. So now what we have to do is pull these 3 strings. So you could pull the top strings. So whatever you do, you want to pull the top or the bottom. You don't want to pull, whoops, that guy got stuck. You don't want to pull like 1 from the bottom, 2 from the top. You have to pull the same side, and I pulled the top. They're kind of hiding in there, not cooperating. So what you're doing is, the goal is to, this guy, sorry, I'll repin that because he was not cooperating. Let's get these out of the way first. Sorry. Anyway. Oh. So the idea and the goal is to pull these threads so that you bunch up your gather, basically your fabric, so that it will fit this shoulder, the arm side, because as you can see, there's just too much fabric. It has to be gathered. So we're going to do that. You can pull on both sides. So I'm just going to get this section nicely gathered first. Work on the other side to get these guys going. Okay, so once you've got all your threads pulled, you're going to want to evenly distribute the gathers between the notches, and so that the raw edges match up and there's no gaping. And then you can just pin them, pin the seams. All these threads, it makes it a little tricky. One thing Tilly says to do once you've gathered your threads is to pick out the gathering stitches, but to be honest, I didn't do that. I just didn't. Just make sure your gathers are nicely spaced, evenly spaced, and not like on top of each other, because that happens and it's not really what you want. And it does take a little bit of time. You have to just work it, and eventually it will come together. I think this looks good. So what you want to do is you just want to baste it in place using a straight stitch. Again, length 4. And you're just going to stitch from the double notch to the single notch. Don't worry yet about stitching the bottom armholes into place. We'll do that once we're satisfied with how this turns out. So we'll just take this over to the machine and we're going to baste it into place, but use a 3/8 seam allowance when you baste it in. So one thing you want to do is when you are basting this in is you want to be careful not to squash these gathers. I know that seems kind of odd but to say because you have to roll over them, but basically you want to maintain the integrity of these really nice little folds, and I'll try to show you what that means. That's a little bit harder to explain, so I'm going to go ahead and back tack, whoops, and yes, I sew over my pins. These pins are very fine. I know people will tell you not to, but I do. So you want to just kind of keep them evenly distributed and kind of going in the right direction so they're not all like clumped on top of each other, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard to explain. I don't know. Like this guy. Sometimes you gotta put your needle up and not your needle, put your foot up, leave your needle down to hold the fabric and just work up that gather. Make it go where it needs to go. So also when you're doing this, you want to make sure that this fabric underneath is smooth. Can be tricky, especially when you have all these gathers, but do your best. And then once you get to the second set of notches, back tack, got all these gathering threads making it tricky. Let's take the pins out and see how this looks. And if we're happy with it, we can go ahead and stitch it in for real using the zigzag stitch. So let's take a look here at the ironing board. So as you can see, it's in. And we're just going to take a look. It looks good. I mean, it's nicely gathered, which is what it's supposed to do. And if you're happy with it, you can go ahead and finish pinning the sleeve into the hole and stitch it for good. So let's just go over here to our lovely table. And so what I mean by that is, and you could go ahead and cut your gathering threads so they're not in the way. So as you can see here, here's the top of my sleeve. What we can do now is just continue to pin the sleeve together at the bottom of the armholes to the side seam. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you what that looks like. So I have finished pinning, and I just wanted to show you that it's right sides together, of course. This has already been stitched, as you recall. It's been basted in. And what I did is I just pinned in from the notch to the underarm, the beginning of the underarm. I think I might have called it side seam earlier, but it's the underarm seam right here, okay? So this is your underarm, or your armpit area, and then it goes up, around the sleeve cap, and then this continues to the underarm. And this is where the underarm seam is. So you just need to pin that together because that was not basted in. And what we're going to do now is stitch them together using a 5/8 inch seam, the zigzag, and we're going to permanently stitch it in. Alright, I've got it set up here at the sewing machine. I'm using the zigzag stitch, 1.5 millimeters in width, and then the length is 2, just like I have used for all the other stitches. So let's go ahead and start. Back tack and go. Okay, so just make sure everything's smooth and nothing gets caught underneath, because that happens to me more than I'd like to admit. And you still need to make sure that your gathers are nice and neat, because you're stitching out 5/8, which is beyond the 3/8 basting, so we could still, I don't want to say ruin, but you know, you still have to make sure that the integrity of these gathers is maintained. I have to tell you, I'm not exactly fond of stitching gathers. I've put the bodice back onto my dress form so we can evaluate. So this is my finished sleeve, and this is the almost finished sleeve that we are working on. And I just wanted to see how the gathers are looking. I think it looks pretty good. I think the sleeve looks pretty good. So as you can see, what we have left is the side seam and then the underarm seam of this bodice, and we are going to actually stitch these together using one continuous seam. So we need to go ahead and pin the front side seam and the back side seam together, and then the underarm of the sleeve. And let me do that, and then I can show you what it looks like, and I can point out how it needs to be stitched. What we need to do is sew up the side seam and the underarm seam of the sleeve. So what we're going to do is put it right sides together. Let us... I'm a menace. Okay. A little bit hard sometimes. So here's your underarm seams, right? Because this is your sleeve. So you need to make sure that you're matching up these underarm seams. Okay. I've got my my seam allowance going towards the sleeve hem. There's probably a rule about which direction it should go, but that's just how I'm doing it. So does it matter in the grand scheme of things? Probably not. So just make sure that those seams are matching, because it feels really good when you get seams matching. So now I'm going to continue to pin. This is the underarm of the sleeve. You got to pin these together. Matching raw edges to raw edges. Then you're going to continue, because after this seam it starts to become the side seam of the bodice. Now I realize that might be hard to visualize, but trust me, that is the case. So just look at one of your shirts, your ready-made shirts, and you'll see. So you're just going to continue to pin the side seam all the way down to the waistline of your bodice. Okay. And also, I did want to mention that before I did this, I went ahead and I serged off my seam. Now this is the sleeve cap. This is the shoulder seam. I went ahead and after I stitched it together, I serged it just to clean it up. You don't have to do that, because remember, we're working with knits, and knits don't fray. But if possible, I like to serge just to clean it up. I just think it looks better. So it looks like this is a little bit off, but I'll fix it. But what the point is, I wanted to show you with this bodice. If I turn it right side out, or inside out, that'll help you visualize it, I think. See? What we have just pinned is the underarm seam matching those two seams, pinning down the side seam. So what you're going to do when you sew, you'll go from here, you'll pivot, and you'll continue down. It's one continuous seam. So again, you're going to start at the sleeve hem, go along here, you're going to pivot and go all the way down to the waistline. And you'll do that at a 5/8 inch seam with a zigzag. Again, I'm using a 1.5 millimeters width and 2 millimeters in length. I've got my bodice back at my machine, and I'm going to start at the sleeve hem, back tack, and continuing into that kind of armpit area now. And you see here, you kind of got to pivot that a little bit, right? To get oh, this little thing wants to get stuck on the so yeah, I've repinned that side seam because it wasn't matching up when I pinned it, so better now. And you're not pulling, remember, I know I've said that many times, but don't pull. So here's our lovely little lady here. This is the finished sleeve. This one we just put in, and all we have to do is hem it. As you can see there, she's got. But look, it looks really good. I mean, I love this top. It's just so cute, and I mean, it'd be such a great little top if you wanted to cut it off here and hem it and just use it with skirts. The Agnes pattern for the just the top itself is longer and a little bit more, I don't want to say a little bit drapey or looser at the bottom. But this one is more tight because I've cut it off because we're going to add the skirt. But anyway, let's go ahead and take this over to the ironing board so we can start to fold in our hem. And I've decided to use an inch hem, though the pattern calls for 3/4. I just decided on an inch because I like the finished length. And I have decided not to serge this. I'm just going to fold it up and then stitch it down. Okay, before I came over here, I went ahead and I finished off that seam that we just stitched with my serger. So what we have to do now is we need to turn under this hem on our sleeve. And I like to use this nice little ruler here. I like to use best press, and I'll use a few pins to pin it into place to hold it while it sets and cools from the iron. Let's just give a spray of best press. This stuff is so great. I'm going to press it up. Go like this, an inch. Okay. Press it up, an inch. I like to press it and then pin it, because as it cools, it'll hold it in place and set it. So just go all the way around, turning up an inch. So once you've got your hem turned up, you can go ahead and stitch it. I've taken the table off of mine because I think the free arm's easier. And since I've turned up an inch, I'm going to go ahead and stitch. You can stitch along, I think that's 7/8 or 3/4. My last hem, I think it looks like I stitched up, I can't remember. Let's double check to make sure, because we want it the same. About 3/4. So I'm just going to do 3/4. That's fine. You can't really tell with this print, which is great. I mean, another thing that you could do is you could cover stitch your hem. I'm not going to, simply because I find that since the zigzag is fine and it's really not noticeable on this thing, it's not noticeable on my print because my print is so busy. So the folded edge of the fabric is going to go along the 3/4 stitch line. And again, we're using the zigzag at a 1.5 millimeter width and a 2 millimeter length. Be careful not to catch any of your sleeve. Make it nice and smooth. Again, don't pull. Just keeping it nice and flat and smooth. And when we get to the end, back tack, clip your threads, of course. Of course, I've got to come over here to my ironing and give this hem a nice press, because you know how I feel about pressing. Nice and crisp. Well, now we've got our second sleeve in. The bodice is done and it's waiting for a skirt. So let's go ahead and get the skirt prepared so we can stitch it onto our bodice, and we're almost done. So now we are going to work on the skirt, and this is one of my skirts. This is a side seam. This is going to be the waist. This is the hem. I have another panel exactly the same. So all we're going to do is lay them on top of each other, right sides together. And what you're going to do is just stitch those side seams together, 5/8 of an inch each side. So then you're just going to have basically a big loop when we're done. Once you've sewn the two triangles, or I'm sorry, rectangles together, and you have the loop, you're going to need to gather the top of the skirt that will be attached to the bodice. And since I've already shown you how to gather it using 3 basting stitches, I thought I would show you how to do it using dental floss, which is another method. The key here is to use the really cheap, thick kind of dental floss, because if you use a really nice stuff like Glide, it's just going to be torn up. I mean, this will even get torn up a little bit too, but if you had Glide, it would just be a mess. So you can start by pulling a lot out, but you can pull as you go. And then what I'm going to do is take the beginning and I'm going to put a lot in the back there. I'm going to put my threads, everybody's to the back. I'm just going to put my foot on the edge of the fabric, and I'm going to have the dental floss kind of in the middle of the foot. I have a zigzag stitch. The length is 3 and then the width is about 4, and that's to make sure that I don't hit the dental floss on accident, because if I do, then I won't be able to pull the string or pull the dental floss. So I'm going to just start, and I'm going to back tack, and then I'm going to continue. And the key here is to kind of hold the dental floss up because it helps keep it centered. And then with this hand, I'm just making sure the fabric stays along the presser foot. And I'll do that for the entire loop of the skirt. Now we have inserted the dental floss into the top of the skirt. So when you pull the floss in either direction, you're going to start to get gathers, which is of course what we want. But first what we need to do is, much like we did with the sleeves, is we need to pin the skirt right sides together with the bodice. So here's my bodice. I'm going to put the bodice basically inside the skirt so that I can access the waistline. And the thing that we want to do first is to take our side seam here and match it with the side seam on the bodice. And the seam should go towards the back. So face those seams towards the back. And we're going to pin and do our very best to make sure that they line up. So you do both side seams. And once you do that, then you can go ahead and work on pulling your floss to get it all nice and gathered and fitted to the bodice. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that to get everybody in shape here. So I'm just going to pull my string and keep pulling until I get a bunch of gathers and get that skirt much smaller than it is, so it will fit. Where's my string? Be careful, because if you pull your string one way too much, then you might pull it out, and then that's going to be a pain in the butt. So pull from both directions, a little bit on each side at a time, and push. Sorry, sometimes I can't see where the camera is. And push those gathers down. Keep going. So I am done finally pinning, and machine the gathers, I will say that I went and took out the dental floss. I wasn't happy with how that was going, and I went and put the rows of threads, and I found that worked better for me for this particular situation. But I did just want to show you how you could use dental floss or string together as well. So I'm going to go ahead and baste this around, see how it looks, and if I'm happy with it, then I'll return and permanently stitch it down. So here's the dress, and we can start evaluating our gathers and seeing how they are. And because this is basted in, you could even still kind of move the gathers about if you need to. But I think overall this looks pretty good. So once you're happy with everything, that's when you just go back to the machine and do the permanent zigzag stitch 5/8 from the raw edge. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to finish it off on the serger. And then the last thing we have to do is just hem the skirt, and the dress is done. So the final step, now that we have the skirt attached to the bodice, is to hem the skirt. I went ahead and serged the bottom of my skirt. That's not necessary because, as you know, knits don't need it, and I didn't do that on the sleeve, but I just decided to go ahead and do it on the skirt. Yeah, so of course I've got my best press. I'm going to give this a squirt. I'm going to use my little ironing ruler, and this is a rectangle skirt, so it's really easy. I don't have to worry about curves. Otherwise, I do have a tool that I like for curved hems, and it is this lovely thing. But today we'll just use this one since we're on a straight line here. And just as we did with the sleeve hem, you're just folding it up to the 1 inch mark and then pressing it. And I'm going to do that all the way around. And there's 60 inches of this skirt to press, so it's going to be a little bit. Okay, my hem has been stitched in, and I want to go ahead and give it a nice press all the way around. I will do that, and then we'll go ahead and inspect the dress and on the dress form. Okay, there she is. So hard to see the print from afar, this sleeve here, but I think it looks really good. There's the skirt. There's the bodice. The only thing I'm worried about in terms of fit is this back. I have a feeling it's going to gape on me, but hopefully not. On the dress form, it's fixed by pulling the front down, so we'll see. But I think this dress came out really cute, and this fabric is really easy to work with. It is so soft. I think it's really great quality, so Joanne, well done. They have a lot of these prints, and if you can go get some, go for it, because it is really, really great fabric. And all in all, I am super pleased. So now I just need to get cleaned up, put it on, and film an introduction for this video. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed this sew along. It's my first one, start to finish, so thank you so much.